Lena Liang locked the door behind me. I felt it in my throat before I even heard the click. The sound was soft, almost polite, but in that office at the top of a 100-year-old building, it landed like a decision. No one outside could hear what happened in that room. The walls were built that way decades ago, back when the two women who owned this company needed privacy for negotiations that shaped half the skyline of Chicago. Now only one of them still worked there. Lena Liang, my CEO, 42, recently divorced, and the most dangerous woman in Chicago's real estate world, now that her former wife had opened a rival firm across the river. I was 24, the HR manager she had hired 3 weeks earlier, which meant that if anyone discovered I was standing alone in her office after hours, my career would be the first thing to disappear. She had already warned me once. "Emily, we need to keep things professional." That should have been the end of it. Instead, she stepped closer, rain still clinging to the sleeve of her coat, her eyes settling on mine like she had already made a decision I hadn't been invited to understand. My pulse climbed into my throat. Because if this moment crossed the wrong line, it wouldn't just ruin my job. It would ruin hers too. And the worst part, when Lena Liang stopped an arm's length away from me, I didn't step back. And that was the moment I knew this was going to change everything. I should have kept my distance. I knew that before I knew anything else, before I understood the building, before I understood her, before I understood what kind of damage a woman like Lena Liang could do without ever raising her voice. The first thing I learned about Halstead and Liang development was that silence had weight. Not normal office silence. Not the thin, temporary quiet you get between phone calls or before a meeting starts. This silence felt built into the walls. The kind that stayed even when people were talking. The kind that made every elevator bell, every heel strike, every low conversation near the reception desk sound sharper than it should have. The building sat on a corner in the Loop, like it had been there before the city learned how to apologize for anything. Limestone facade, brass trim worn soft by decades of hands. Tall windows that reflected a colder version of the street outside. In winter light, it looked less like a corporate headquarters and more like the kind of place where rules were made in rooms without clocks. I remember standing in the lobby on my first morning, with my coat still on, and my pulse already too high, trying not to look as new as I felt. There was a faint smell of polished wood and old paper under the cleaner, brighter scent of coffee drifting from somewhere deeper inside. A security camera light blinked over the front desk. Red. Steady. One of the receptionists gave me a kind smile and handed me a temporary badge while I adjusted the strap of my bag for the third time in under a minute. That became a habit fast. The strap. My coffee cup. The edge of a file folder. Anything I could touch when I needed to look calm before I actually felt calm. "First day?" the receptionist asked. I smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." She said it gently, but I still felt heat creep up my neck. I'd worked hard to get there. Harder than most people would have guessed just by looking at me. That was another thing I was already used to. People seeing the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the body I had never asked to be noticed for, and deciding competence had to be proven twice. Sometimes 3 times. At 24, I had enough experience to know how quickly a room could make up its mind about you. Not enough experience to stop caring every time it happened. Halstead and Liang had hired me as an HR manager during the ugliest internal transition the company had seen in years. Everyone in Chicago's real estate world knew some version of the story. The founders had been a couple. Then they weren't. Then one of them left and opened a competing firm. The business pages called it a split. The people inside the building called it other things, usually in lower voices. Betrayal. War. A mess. No one used those words in orientation, obviously. Officially, I had been brought in to support restructuring, retention, and culture stabilization during a period of strategic reorganization, which sounded polished and bloodless and had almost nothing to do with how it felt inside the building. Inside the building, people watched each other a little too carefully. Inside the building, names still carried residue. Inside the building, every closed door seemed to mean more than it should. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I took it as a challenge. That was my first contradiction. I knew I was walking into a company where loyalty had become a dangerous subject. I knew I was young for the role. I knew the executive floor would look at me and make assumptions before I ever opened my mouth. And still, underneath the nerves and the pressure and the perfectly tailored navy blouse I'd spent too much money on, because I needed to feel like I belonged there, I wanted the chance. I wanted to prove I could hold my ground in a room full of people older, richer, and more cynical than me. I wanted to be taken seriously. And maybe that was the problem from the beginning. Because women like Lena Liang didn't just notice competence. They tested it. Orientation started at 8:30 in a conference room on the 3rd floor. There were 6 of us at the long walnut table, all pretending not to study one another while the HR director, temporary, interim, already halfway out the door, walked us through policies, systems, reporting structures, and the company's new strategic direction in a voice that mattered me. Even interesting things sound tired. I took notes anyway. The radiator hissed softly beneath one of the windows. Someone's laptop fan came on and stayed on. My coffee went lukewarm before I remembered to drink it. Around 10, a phone vibrated on the table, and its owner silenced it too fast, like noise itself was unprofessional there. I noticed everything because I was nervous, and because when I'm nervous I become observant in self-defense. By 11 I knew who interrupted too often, who flinched when the rival firm was mentioned, and who kept glancing toward the hallway every time footsteps passed. I also knew one other thing. Even when Lena Liang wasn't in the room arranged itself around her. I heard her before I saw her. Not her voice. The sound of heels moving across marble somewhere outside the conference room, measured and unhurried. Then the quick shift in air that happens when people straighten without meaning to. A pause in conversation. A stillness that wasn't empty, just alert. The interim director broke off in the middle of a sentence and glanced at the glass panel beside the door. Not anxious, just aware. That was my first real clue. Power announces itself in strange ways. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's just the fact that a room changes shape because one person is nearby. I looked down at my notes and told myself not to be obvious. A second later, the door opened. Lena Liang stepped in with a file in one hand and a phone in the other, and for one disorienting beat my body registered her before my thoughts did. Tall. Elegant. Dark hair worn smooth and loose over one shoulder. A fitted charcoal dress under a black coat she hadn't bothered taking off yet, as if she had only stopped in on her way to something more important. Her face was composed in that dangerous way some women have where they don't need to perform control because it already lives under their skin. She looked expensive. Not flashy. Not decorative. Exact. The room stood up. I stood up half a second later than everyone else, because I was still catching up. Sorry to interrupt, she said, and even her apology sounded like a decision. Her voice was low, clean, impossible to misread. I just need 5 minutes. No one told her she didn't need to apologize. No one would have been stupid enough. The interim director nodded too quickly. Of course. Lena stepped farther into the room, eyes moving over the table once. Efficient. Assessing. Not lingering anywhere long enough to call attention to it. And then they landed on me. Just for a second. Maybe less. But it was enough. There are looks that mean nothing. There are looks that categorize. There are looks that slide past you because they're really aimed at your nameplate, your title, your usefulness. This wasn't any of those. This was a pause so brief I could have invented it, except I felt it physically. A small, sharp awareness right under my ribs. I held her gaze because looking away too fast would have made me feel 16. Her eyes were dark. Steady. Colder than I expected and somehow more tired. Then the moment was gone. She turned to the director, asked 2 concise questions about revised staffing projections, gave 1 adjustment to the reporting chain, and accepted the file she'd come for. The whole interruption lasted maybe 3 minutes. But I remember all of it. The rain-dark wool of her coat. The metallic glint of her watch when she reached for the papers. The way everyone else seemed to exhale only after she left. When the door closed behind her, the interim director laughed softly, like she'd just survived weather. I wrote something useless in the margin of my notes just to have something to do with my hand. What I should tell you is that nothing happened then. And technically that would be true. She didn't flirt with me. She didn't say anything inappropriate. She barely looked at me at all. If I were trying to tell the story like it was harmless, I could stop right there and say I was just intimidated by a powerful woman on my first day. That would be the sensible version. It would also be a lie. Because something did happen. Not between us. Not yet. Inside me. Something small. A shift so slight I only recognized it later. Like the first hairline crack in glass. I knew who she was before I met her. Of course I did. Everyone did. Lena Liang wasn't just the CEO. She was one half of a company people used to talk about as if it were a marriage with a skyline attached. She and her ex-wife had built luxury towers, restored historic properties, and made themselves impossible to ignore in a city that respected ambition only slightly more than cruelty. Now the ex-wife was gone. So was the marriage. So was any illusion that the split had been clean. And still Lena walked through the building like she would rather die than let anyone see a bruise. I should have admired that from a safe distance. Instead, I kept thinking about the way her eyes had paused on me. Too close, I thought, without really knowing what I meant. That phrase stayed with me. Too close. At noon, I was shown to my office. It was smaller than I expected, but better than I had hoped for. High ceiling, narrow window facing an alley, and a slice of sky. 2 bookcases, 1 filing cabinet that stuck a little when I tried to open it, and a desk lamp with a green glass shade that made everything look older. They're dark. Someone had already left my login credentials, a building map, and a stack of onboarding folders in the center of the desk. My chair squeaked when I sat down. I adjusted it twice, then a third time. Outside my door, the hallway carried its usual muted rhythm. Phones. Footsteps. A copier somewhere in the distance. A murmur of voices that never rose high enough to become laughter. I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly what I had been hired to do. Reading internal reports. Flagging retention risk. Reviewing exit interviews from the weeks after the partnership split. Noting patterns in language people thought were subtle, but weren't. Phrases like uncertainty at the top, competing directives, confidential concerns, questions about long-term leadership stability. Everyone in HR learns to read what people mean when they're trying not to say it. These people were scared. Some were angry. A few were already looking for exits. The building didn't just feel quiet because it was old. It felt quiet because everyone was waiting to see which version of the future would survive. I lost track of time until someone knocked once on my open door frame. I looked up expecting an assistant or a coordinator. It was Lena. No coat this time. Just the charcoal dress, close-fitting, and severe in a way that somehow made her more striking, not less. Up close, the details sharpened. Fine gold earring. Clean lines. The faintest trace of something expensive and understated in the air around her. Dry, warm, almost cedar, with something darker underneath. My heartbeat reacted before the rest of me did. "Nan," I said, standing too quickly. Her eyes flicked to the folders spread across my desk. "You can call me Lena internally." I nodded. "Of course." She stayed in the doorway another second, looking not at me exactly but through the shape of the room, taking inventory. "How much have you seen so far? Enough to know people are holding back in the official reports." One corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. Not really. More like acknowledgement. "Good." I waited. She didn't fill silence to make other people comfortable. I noticed that immediately. She let it sit there, full and intact, until I had to fight the urge to speak just to smooth the air. "I read the retention summaries from the last 8 weeks, I said. "The language is careful. Too careful." Meaning people are afraid of choosing the wrong side. That our full attention. She looked at me then. Directly. No room for bluffing. "And what side do you think that is?" The smart answer would have been neutral. Diplomatic. Something polished enough to survive repetition. Instead I said, "I think most of them don't know anymore." Silence. Not hostile. Worse. Precise. I became acutely aware of everything at once. The soft hum from my desk lamp. The cool metal edge of the paperclip in my fingers. The fact that I was standing alone in my office with the CEO of the company, answering a question I probably should have handled more carefully. Then she stepped inside and closed the door halfway behind her. Not shut. Just enough to turn the hallway into a blur. Something in me tightened. Too close. "You're honest," she said. I swallowed. "You hired me." I did. The air felt different with her in the room. Not charged in any dramatic, reckless way. Charged in the way storm air feels before anything visible happens. "The pressure changes first. I didn't hire you for diplomacy," she continued. "I hired you because the last person in your role was more interested in keeping executives comfortable than telling the truth." I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt seen, and that was somehow worse. Seen is dangerous when you're new. Seen is dangerous when the person seeing you has the power to make your career in one sentence and end it in the next. I set the paper clip down so she wouldn't notice I was holding it too tightly. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "A clear picture. Quickly." "I can do that. I know." It was such a simple answer. No embellishment. No praise. Just certainty. My body reacted to certainty like it was heat. I hated that. I hated how young it made me feel. How transparent. How suddenly aware I became of my own hands, my own mouth. The fact that I had chosen a blouse with a neckline I had thought looked professional that morning, and was now irrationally wondering whether she had noticed it. No. Not that. Not exactly. It wasn't vanity. It was exposure. The sharp discomfort of being in a room with someone whose attention made me conscious of my own edges. Lena moved toward the bookcase behind the guest chair and glanced at the framed renderings someone had left there of one of the firm's restoration projects. "The building has its own habits," she said. "You'll notice them." I almost laughed from nerves. "I've noticed the silence." That almost smile again. Faster this time. "Yes." She turned back to me. "Don't mistake silence for calm." The line hit harder than it should have. Maybe because it wasn't just about the company. Maybe because by then I was already beginning to understand that everything about Lena lying came layered. Nothing she said seemed to sit only on the surface. Every sentence carried the possibility of another meaning beneath it, and the danger was that I wanted to hear all of them. I should not have wanted that from my CEO. I knew the rule before anyone had to say it. She was my boss. She was 18 years older than me. She had been divorced for 3 months from the woman she had built this company with. The entire executive floor was under scrutiny. The rival firm was circling. Employees were already anxious. One rumor in the wrong hallway could have followed me farther than any promotion ever would. Nothing had happened, and already I could see the boundary. That was the problem. Sometimes the line becomes dangerous long before anyone crosses it. Lena asked me 3 more questions about the onboarding data. I answered all of them. My voice stayed steady even when my pulse didn't. At one point her phone lit up in her hand with a preview message she turned over without reading. I caught only a name, one I recognized from the company's old partnership records. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then it was gone. That was the second thing I learned about her. Control wasn't just her nature. It was labor. When she finally turned toward the door, the room seemed to loosen around her movement. "Emily." I looked up. She hadn't opened the door yet. She was standing with one hand on the brass handle, profile sharp against the muted light from the hallway. "Yes. Don't let people use your age to explain your judgment." Something warm and immediate moved through me before I could stop it. "Okay," I said, and it came out softer than I intended. Her fingers stayed on the handle for 1 second more. "And don't confuse being underestimated with being safe." Then she left. I stood there after the door swung open, then closed, listening to the hallway return in pieces. A cart rattling somewhere farther down. A printer starting up. 2 assistants speaking in low voices near the corner. Ordinary sounds. Real life. But my office no longer felt ordinary. I sat back down slowly. My chair squeaked again. The coffee on my desk had gone completely cold. I picked it up anyway and took a sip. Bitter. Thin. Useless. My hand was not steady. That should have embarrassed me more than it did. Instead, I kept hearing her voice. "Don't mistake silence for calm. Don't confuse being underestimated with being safe." The words settled into me differently each time, like they were finding places to stay. I tried to go back to work. I really did. I opened another retention file. Read 2 paragraphs. Realized I hadn't understood either of them. Reached for my pen. Put it down again. Outside, snow had started to collect in the corner of the window frame, white against stone, and the narrow slice of afternoon light had gone silver. Somewhere above me, or maybe 2 floors over, a door closed with enough force to register through the walls. I thought about Lena's hand on the brass handle. Thought about the message she hadn't answered. Thought about the way the whole building seemed to orbit absences no one wanted to name. And beneath all of that, against my better judgment, I thought about the pause when she had looked at me in the conference room. Then again in my office. Measured. Focused. Not personal. Probably not personal. So why had it felt personal? I didn't have an answer for that. Only the beginning of a pattern. Too close. By 6:30, most of my floor had emptied. One by one, doors opened, coats came on, lights clicked off. The receptionist outside the departmental suite called goodnight to someone I hadn't met yet. A phone vibrated on a desk down the hall and went unanswered. I stayed. Partly because there was work to do. Partly because leaving early on my first week felt wrong. And partly because some unwise, restless part of me wanted to understand the building after hours, when people stopped performing normalcy, and whatever was underneath had more room to breathe. The old place changed in the evening. Heat came up slower. Shadows lengthened. The wood darkened into something richer and quieter. My desk lamp cast a small pool of green-tinted light over the folders, while the rest of the office softened at the edges. 7:10, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Measured. Familiar already. I froze with a page half turned in my hand. They didn't stop at my door. They kept going toward the staircase leading to the executive floor. Still, my skin had already gone alert. That was when I understood the part I didn't want to name. Nothing had happened. Nothing had to. The disturbance had already started. Not because she'd touched me. Not because she'd said anything she shouldn't have. But because my body had begun recognizing her before my mind gave permission. The sound of her walking past. The shape of her silence. The exact, dangerous steadiness in her voice. I sat there in the dim office, listening to the building settle around me, and asked myself the question I should have asked sooner. What was I going to do if this got harder instead of easier? I didn't know. I only knew that when I finally looked back down at the report in my hands, I was no longer reading it the way I had an hour earlier. Something had shifted. Small. Sharp. Diet. Irreversible enough to frighten me. And for the first time since I'd walked into that building, I had the uneasy feeling that getting hired might not be the thing that changed my life. Meeting her might be. I tried to make it smaller than it was. That was my first mistake. Not the feeling itself. Just what I called it. Stress. Adrenaline. The pressure of starting a new job in a company that still felt split down the middle, even after the legal documents had been signed and the offices had been rearranged and everyone had learned which names to stop saying out loud. I told myself that was all it was. A response to instability. To scrutiny. To being new in a place where even the polished brass elevator doors seemed to reflect your nerves back at you. That explanation lasted until the next morning. I was standing in the small kitchenette on my floor, waiting for the coffee machine to finish struggling through a second cycle when I heard her voice in the hallway. Low. Controlled. Brief. I couldn't make out the words. Only the shape of them. And my body recognized her before my mind had time to pretend otherwise. A pulse at the base of my throat. A sharpened awareness under my skin. The paper cup in my hand suddenly too light, too flimsy, like I needed something steadier to hold. I hated that. I hated how quickly it had started happening. How physical it was. How involuntary. The rational part of me knew exactly how dangerous that kind of recognition could become, especially in a building where almost everyone had grown skilled at noticing what wasn't being said. Too close, I thought again, staring at the thin line of coffee rising toward the lip of the cup. Then I heard heels on stone, measured and unhurried, passing the kitchenette without pause. I didn't look. Not immediately. Which meant that 2 seconds later I was looking anyway, my head turning just enough to catch the edge of her reflection in the metal trim of the hallway window before she disappeared around the corner. That should have embarrassed me more than it did. Instead, I stood there with coffee I didn't really want, listening to the machine hiss behind me, and understood something I didn't want to admit yet. Avoidance only works when the thing you're avoiding isn't already inside your nervous system. The rest of the morning moved fast. Meetings. Introductions. A spreadsheet review with payroll. 2 difficult one-on-ones with employees whose loyalty to the company had become tangled up with their loyalty to the woman who no longer worked there. One of them cried halfway through. The other sat so still, I could practically hear the effort it took not to say the wrong thing. I kept notes. Asked careful questions. Marked patterns. People kept circling the same fear without naming it directly. They didn't know which decisions were strategic and which were personal. They didn't know whether the company was still being run by a vision or by a wound. They didn't know who was leaving next. And underneath all of that, there was another tension. One that felt less official and more instinctive. Like people were testing the air before they spoke, waiting to see whether the old balance of power had really died, or if some part of it was still walking the hallways in a different form. At 11:40, one of the executive assistants emailed asking if I could come upstairs for a staffing review packet that had been revised overnight. The executive floor. I read the message twice, even though it was perfectly clear the first time. Then I closed my laptop, picked up my notepad, and told myself not to be ridiculous. The elevator was empty when I stepped in. The brass panel beside the buttons had been polished recently, but years of use still lived in the edges. As the car rose, I caught my reflection in the brushed metal door seam. Composed enough. Hairpinned back. Navy slacks. Cream blouse. A face that looked younger when I was nervous and knew it. I adjusted the cuff at my wrist. Then again. The doors opened onto a quieter hallway than the ones below. Thicker carpet. Dark wood trim. Framed architectural renderings under soft lighting. Even the air felt different, cooler somehow, more controlled. There was no visible sign that anyone moved through this space in a hurry, even though everyone probably did. I checked in with the assistant at the front desk, and she told me the packet wasn't ready yet. 10 minutes, maybe 15. That's fine. Would you like to wait? I almost said no. Almost told her I'd come back. Instead I said, sure. That was the first moral fault line, though I didn't call it that then. Because nothing about waiting on the executive floor was inappropriate. Nothing about accepting a chair near the windows while an assistant assembled documents was reckless. I could defend every part of it, even to myself. The problem was that I knew why my pulse had climbed anyway. Not because I had to be there. Because she might be. That's how these things begin. Not with a kiss. Not with a touch. Not even with a confession. With a choice that remains technically innocent, even while your body knows better. I sat with the packet request email still open on my phone, pretending to review it while the city moved in clean gray lines beyond the tall windows. Traffic below. A plume of steam from a rooftop vent. Tiny figures crossing the street against the light. Somewhere behind me, a phone rang once, then stopped. A printer started up in one of the offices and fed out 3 pages in a patient mechanical rhythm. The outside world kept going. Made it worse somehow. Because inside my chest, everything felt disproportionately loud. Too close. I didn't hear Lena approach this time. I felt the shift first, something subtle in the hallway. The way people's voices lowered half a register. The way the assistant at the front desk sat straighter before she even looked up. Then Lena's reflection appeared in the window glass beside me. I stood too fast. She stopped in front of the desk. Not directly in front of me, but near enough that I caught the clean dark line of her blazer sleeve in my peripheral vision before I fully turned. Emily. Just my name. Nothing else. And yet my body answered to it. Lena. Her gaze moved once over the notepad in my hand, then back to my face. Waiting long? Not long. The assistant murmured something about the revised packet being almost done, and disappeared into the records room. Which left the two of us in a silence that wasn't private, not exactly, but felt sharpened by the possibility of becoming so. You've been busy, Lena said. It wasn't really a question. I nodded. So have you. A slight tilt of her head. I asked first. Heat rose under my collar before I could stop it. There it was. That subtle shift I had been half expecting, half imagining. Not flirtation. Not softness. Just the clean pressure of her attention narrowing, the sense that she was choosing to focus on me more directly than she needed to. I met with 2 department heads this morning, I said. And 3 individual follow-ups from the retention list. What did they tell you? That they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. To whom? I held her gaze a second longer than I should have. That depends on who they think still has power. Her expression changed so slightly anyone else might have missed it. A tightening at one corner of her mouth. Not anger. Recognition, maybe. Or irritation at hearing a truth she already knew. And what do you think? She asked. The sensible version of me should have answered carefully. Something neutral. Something useful but deniable. But there was something about the way she looked at me that made polish feel false. I think people can survive instability, I said quietly. What they don't know how to survive is ambiguity. The words hung there between us. A phone rang in the far office. Someone passed the doorway carrying a portfolio tube. The assistant's keyboard started clicking again from behind the desk. The world kept moving. But Lena didn't look away. For one suspended beat, neither did I. This was the charged exchange. Not dramatic from the outside. No one would have stopped and stared. No one would have heard anything in our voices that could be repeated later as proof of something dangerous. But I felt it. The stillness. The awareness. The fact that my breath had gone shallower, and I was suddenly conscious of the distance between us, as if distance itself had become physical. Then Lena said, "That's a better answer." I should not have cared that she approved of me. I cared immediately. The assistant came back with the packet at exactly the wrong moment, handing it over with a bright professional smile that made me feel almost normal again. Almost. "Thank you," I said, taking it with hands that I hoped looked steadier than they felt. Lena stepped aside to let me pass. She didn't touch me. She didn't need to. The brush of her presence as I moved by was enough to send a clean line of heat down my spine. Just proximity. The scent I now associated with her before I wanted to, something dry and warm with that darker edge beneath it, expensive and restrained. By the time the elevator doors closed behind me, I was angry. Not at her. At myself. Because I knew exactly how easy it would be to dress that moment up as nothing. A brief conversation. A professional exchange. A simple acknowledgement that I had done my job well. And if I told the story that way, I could still believe I was in control. Trouble was, the lie already felt thin. I took the packet back to my office and forced myself into work. Data entry. Department summaries. Notes for a policy review meeting the next day. The fluorescent overhead light buzzed faintly until I turned it off and used the desk lamp instead. My coffee went cold again. At 3:17, my phone vibrated with a delivery notification for shoes I'd forgotten I ordered. At 4 o'clock, someone in legal laughed too loudly in the hall and immediately lowered their voice after. Real life. Small life. Ordinary details. I clung to them because they were easier to manage than the fact that Lena's approval had settled into me like warmth I didn't deserve to keep. Around 5, I opened one of the revised staffing sheets and found a discrepancy in the projected transfer list. 2 employees tagged for reassignment, whose names also appeared in a confidential performance-concerned file. That should have been impossible. It suggested either sloppy overlap or intentional maneuvering, and nothing about this company made me assume sloppiness first. I cross-checked dates. Opened archive notes. Found a chain of edits that made even less sense. Then I saw one name in the approval history that made my stomach tighten. Not Lena's. Her ex-wife's. The old system still carried ghosts. That was the practical version of it. The emotionally honest version was uglier. Because the moment I saw the name, my first instinct wasn't corporate. It was protective. Of Lena. I leaned back in my chair and shut my eyes for a second. That was not a good sign. Not because concern itself was wrong. Anyone with basic emotional intelligence might feel sympathy for a CEO trying to rebuild a company after a public divorce and a competitive split. But what moved through me in that moment didn't feel detached or abstract. It felt immediate. Personal. As if the damage done to her had somehow entered the room with me. I opened my eyes and stared at the transfer sheet again. This was a mistake, I thought. Not the discrepancy. The direction of my attention. This was a mistake. The phrase landed harder the second time. At 6:10, I emailed the relevant documents to myself securely and headed upstairs again. I told myself it was because the issue couldn't wait until morning. That was true. I told myself it made sense to bring something sensitive directly to the CEO rather than let it circulate through too many hands. Also true. The danger in these stories is never that the reasons are false. It's that they're true enough to hide inside. The executive assistant was packing her bag when I arrived. "She's still here," she said before I even asked. "Last office on the left." I should have left the documents and asked her to deliver them. I knew that. I knew it so clearly that for half a second I even paused with the file folder against my chest and looked down the corridor as if distance alone might restore my judgment. Then I walked anyway. The hallway lights had dimmed to evening mode, softer now, warmer against the dark trim and framed blueprints. The building had that after-hours stillness I was already beginning to understand. Not empty, not quiet exactly, but stripped down to essentials. Somewhere farther away, a vacuum hummed on another floor. Pipes ticked softly behind the walls. Through one tall window at the end of the corridor, Chicago had gone blue and silver, the city lights beginning to assert themselves against the early dark. Lena's door was slightly open. I knocked once against the wood. "Come in." Her voice traveled differently at night. Or maybe my body received it differently. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, though not all the way. The office was even larger than I had remembered, made more intimate by the low light. One lamp was on near the seating area. Another on her desk. The rest of the room lived in shadow and clean lines, wood, leather, paper, glass. The windows behind her showed a slice of the city and a reflection of the room layered over it. Lena looked up from a spread of contracts, sleeves rolled once at her forearms, blazer gone, the top button of her blouse undone in a way that shouldn't have mattered and did. My breath changed. That was humiliatingly simple. Emily. I found something in the transfer review. At once her focus sharpened. Show me. I crossed the room and set the file on her desk. She stood to look at it, coming close enough that I had to decide where to put my eyes. The documents. Her hand. Thin line of her mouth. Anywhere but the open collar. I chose the documents and hated myself for being relieved by paper. For several minutes we worked. Really worked. I walked her through the edit trail, the duplicated names, the archived approval stamps still embedded in the old software logic. She asked precise questions. I answered them. The problem got clearer, uglier. A delayed administrative contamination from before the split, maybe accidental, maybe not. Can it be traced? She asked. Yes, I said, but not quietly. Her fingers stilled over the page. Meaning if someone wanted these names moved without drawing attention, correcting it through the standard chain will alert too many people. Too many on which side? There it was again. Not just a company. A wound with departments. I let out a breath. Possibly both. Lena went very still. This was one of those moments when nothing physically happened for several seconds, and yet the tension thickened instead of easing. She didn't touch the papers. Didn't look out the window. Didn't pace. She only stood there beside me, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, eyes fixed on the page as if stillness itself were helping her think. I became absurdly aware of the silence between our breaths. A faint ticking of the clock I couldn't see, of the warmth of my own skin beneath my blouse. Then Lena said without looking up, "You came here yourself." "Yes, you could have sent this." "I could have." Only then did she turn her head. "What made you decide not to?" It was a fair question. An easy question. And suddenly impossible to answer cleanly. Because there were several truths available to me, and none of them were equally safe. I could have said discretion. I could have said urgency. I could have said I didn't trust email for something like this. All defensible. All partial. What I could not say was that part of me had wanted to be the person who brought it to her. Had wanted to step into this room again. Had wanted, God, even privately the word felt dangerous, to matter to her in a way that extended beyond competence. My pulse moved once, hard at the base of my throat. "This felt too sensitive to pass around," I said finally. Lena held my gaze for a second too long. "That isn't the only reason." It wasn't phrased as a question. Something hot and immediate moved through me. Not anger. Exposure. I looked down at the file. No. The office changed in that instant. Or I did. Not because either of us had crossed a visible line, but because she had named the existence of another reason without forcing me to define it, and that was somehow more intimate than if she had pushed harder. Outside the office, footsteps passed in the hallway. A phone rang once at the assistant desk and stopped. The city beyond the windows kept burning through dusk. My body had gone very still, but inside that stillness there was too much happening. Heat. Awareness. The urge to step back colliding with the urge to stay exactly where I was. This was the second moral fault line. Because I could have repaired the moment right then. I could have laughed softly, redirected to the documents, made the air normal again. She had left me room to do that. I didn't. Not because I was brave. Because some part of me wanted to know what would happen if I let the silence keep breathing. Lena's voice, when it came, was lower than before. "Emily." Just my name. Again. And still my body answered. I made myself look up. She was close enough now that if either of us shifted even slightly, the distance would become a different thing. Her face gave away almost nothing. But not nothing. There was strain there, cleanly held. Something disciplined. Something tired. Something that made me think of all the private battles this room had witnessed before I ever walked into the building. "You're very good at your job," she said. The words should have felt simple. They didn't. "Thank you. That is not what makes this complicated." My breath caught. There it was. Clearer than before. Not explicit. Not deniable either. The room seemed to narrow around us. The desk. The files. The old wood. the reflection of her shoulder in the darkened window glass. My own pulse loud enough to feel in my wrists. I should have stepped back. I didn't. There was an internal question waiting for me there, private and sharp enough to change the shape of the moment if I answered it honestly. Was I really going to let one sentence from my CEO rearrange my judgment this easily? I didn't answer it. I don't think I could have. Instead, I heard myself say very quietly, "Then what does?" Lena looked at me in a way no one had looked at me in a very long time. Not as if I was younger. Not as if I was decorative. Not as if I needed protecting from the realities of a room like this. She looked at me as if I had just made something harder for both of us. "That you don't seem to understand how closely people watch me," she said. I swallowed. "I understand. No?" A brief pause. "You understand in theory." The words stung because they were true. She moved then, not toward me exactly, but around the corner of the desk, which somehow changed the room more than an actual approach would have. There was no furniture between us now. No file folder. No excuse built out of paper. "When I leave a meeting 3 minutes early, someone writes their own story about it," she continued. "When I don't answer a message, someone notices. When I hire someone younger than the board expected, people make assumptions before she sat through her first week." I stood very still. "And when that someone is talented," she said, "and beautiful, and new enough to unsettle a room before she even intends to," she stopped. The silence after that was heavier than touch. I felt heat move under my skin so fast it almost frightened me. That was the destabilizing shift. Not because she had called me beautiful, though she had. And not because she had finally admitted there was something here worth naming, though she had done that too. It was because for the first time, I understood that whatever had been happening inside me had not been happening in isolation. She had seen it. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not from the first moment. But enough. Enough to be careful. Enough to be here in this room choosing every word like it mattered. Enough to make restraint feel like a living thing between us. I should have said something smart. Instead I said, "You noticed." The second it left my mouth, I knew how revealing it was. Lena's expression changed, not softer exactly, but more honest. "I notice everything in this building," she said. It should have felt like a deflection. It didn't. Because she said it while looking directly at me. Somewhere far below us, a siren moved through the city and faded. The old radiator along the side wall clicked once as the heat adjusted. My phone vibrated in my pocket and I ignored it. The outside world kept moving. Inside that office, I felt suspended just outside my own good judgment. "This was a mistake," I said, and the phrase came out so softly it sounded almost like I was telling myself. Lena heard it anyway. "Yes." But neither of us moved. I don't know how long we stood there. 5 seconds. 10. Maybe less. Long enough for the moment to become real in my body. Long enough for my breath to shift again. Long enough for stillness to stop feeling passive and start feeling chosen. Then Lena stepped back first. Not abruptly. Not coldly. With visible effort. She turned toward the window and reached for the glass of water on the side table, though I didn't think she actually wanted it. I thought she needed something neutral to hold. "You should go home," she said. The line should have been dismissal. It landed like mercy. I hated that I wanted to resist it. I hated even more that part of me wanted to obey because I knew she was right. I picked up the file from the desk, then realized I didn't need it and set it back down. My hands were not steady. I curled them once, subtly, into my palms and hoped she didn't notice. She noticed everything. At the door, I stopped. Another mistake. I knew it before I turned. Lena was still by the window, one hand around the water glass, the city lights catching in the reflection behind her so that for a second she looked doubled. One woman standing in the office, another suspended in the dark glass behind her. "Lena." She looked at me over her shoulder. I didn't know what I was going to say until I heard it. "I do understand the risk." Her gaze held mine. "And you came here anyway," she said. There was no accusation in it. That made it worse. I should have lied. I should have said the documents mattered more than anything else. That I would have come to any executive with the same urgency. That she was making this mean something it didn't. Instead, I stood there with my hand on the door and let the truest answer win. Yes. The word changed something. Not outwardly. The room remained exactly what it had been. An office in an old Chicago building. 2 women standing too close to a problem with plausible business reasons between them. Files on the desk. City in the windows, night coming on. But inside me something tightened. A thread pulled through flesh. Because now I knew the most dangerous part of all of it. It wasn't that Lena had seen me. It was that when given the chance to step back cleanly, I had let her see that I knew what I was doing. And I had stayed anyway. When I left her office, the hallway felt colder than before. The executive assistant was gone. Half the lights had been turned down. My own reflection in the dark window at the end of the corridor looked unfamiliar to me. Same clothes, same face, same neatly pinned hair, but changed by something no one else could have identified at a glance. The elevator took too long. While I waited, my phone vibrated again in my pocket. A text from an old friend asking if I wanted drinks Friday. Another from my sister sending a picture of her dog wearing a sweater and calling him emotionally unavailable but trying. Small life. Sweet life. Harmless life. I stared at the messages and felt impossibly far away from them. In the elevator alone, I leaned my head back against the wood-paneled wall for 1 second and shut my eyes. This was a mistake. No, not exactly. Mistakes are usually accidents, missteps, things you do before you understand their cost. This felt worse. This felt like the beginning of something I already knew enough to fear. By the time I reached my floor, the cleaning staff had started. One woman nodded at me while replacing a trash liner near the copy room. I smiled back, walked to my office, gathered my bag, shut down my computer. My desk lamp clicked off. The room went flat and ordinary in the overhead light. I stood there longer than I needed to with one hand resting on the back of my chair. Too close. The phrase returned again, altered now. Not a warning. A fact. Outside, Chicago had gone fully dark, the sidewalks washed in reflected light and old winter damp. I stepped out of the building into cold air that smelled faintly metallic, and for one irrational second, I had the distinct sensation that part of me was still upstairs. Still in that office. Still in the silence after she called me beautiful like it was an inconvenience. Still in the look she gave me when I admitted I understood the risk. I walked 2 blocks before I realized I was holding my breath every time a black car slowed near the curb, as if some reckless part of me had invented the possibility that she might appear again before the night ended. She didn't. Of course she didn't. That would have been easier in a way. Easier than going home alone with the truth, because the truth was no longer theoretical. I had gone into her office with a file in my hands and a reason I could defend. I had walked out with something far more dangerous. Not permission, not promise, recognition. And once someone like Lena lying recognizes that you're willing to stand in the tension and not run from it, the air between you never feels harmless again. I told myself I could fix it by acting normal. That was the plan the next morning. Not a good plan. Just the only one that let me get dressed, leave my apartment, and walk back into that building without feeling like I had already crossed some line I could never uncross. Normal meant arriving on time. Normal meant answering emails, reviewing personnel notes, speaking in calm, measured sentences, and keeping my eyes on the work in front of me, instead of the office 2 floors above mine. Normal meant pretending that the night before had settled into something manageable. It hadn't. The moment I stepped through the revolving door, the building gave me back to myself in pieces I didn't want. Brass. Stone. The faint scent of polished wood rising under the sharper smell of cold air dragged in from the street. The security camera light blinked red above the front desk. My heels struck the marble in a rhythm that sounded too clear in the morning quiet. And under all of it, memory. Not even a full memory. Just fragments that landed in my body before they formed into thought. Her voice, lower in the evening. That pause after she called me beautiful. The look she gave me when I said yes. My pulse reacted before I had even reached the elevator. I tightened my grip on my bag and kept walking. Too close. The phrase returned so automatically now that I barely felt myself think it. By 8:15, I was at my desk with my laptop open, 2 HR summaries half finished, and a coffee going cold beside my hand because I kept forgetting to drink it. The city outside my narrow window had turned the color of old silver. Somewhere down the hall, someone was arguing softly with a copier. A phone rang twice, stopped, then rang again. Ordinary sounds. Useful sounds. I needed them. They were the only things keeping me inside the day instead of inside what had happened in her office. What almost happened. What had happened anyway. That was the trouble. Nothing physical had crossed between us. No kiss. No touch. No obvious event that could be circled in red and named as the point of no return. And yet something in me had shifted so deeply that even sitting at my own desk felt different, as if I had become visible to myself in a way I had avoided for a long time. I wanted her. There it was. Private. Quiet. Indisputable. Not abstractly. Not as some vague attraction to a woman who happened to be powerful and elegant and impossible not to notice. I wanted Lena lying specifically. Her attention. Her voice when it turned lower. The strain in her restraint. The dangerous steadiness of the way she looked at me when she already knew the truth and chose not to force it into language. I stared at the paragraph on my screen till the words blurred. This was the internal fracture, not the attraction itself. I could have survived attraction. People survive that every day. It was the fact that I couldn't tell myself anymore that what I wanted was harmless. Because harmless things don't change the way your body enters a room. Harmless things don't make you rehearse neutral expressions before meetings. Harmless things don't make your own name sound different when she says it. At 9, I had a policy review with 2 department managers and 1 attorney from compliance. It should have grounded me. Instead, it only sharpened everything. I noticed too much. The way one manager kept tapping her ring against the conference table every time retention came up. The attorney's clipped tone when executive approvals were mentioned. The fact that 1 open seat at the table had clearly been set out of habit for someone who no longer worked there. A water glass. A printed agenda. No one removed it for the first 10 minutes. Ghosts again. This company was full of them. Maybe that was part of what made the whole thing feel more dangerous than it should have. Halstead and Lying wasn't just a place where people worked. It was a place where private history had already bled into corporate structure and left stains no one could fully scrub out. Everyone was living inside the aftermath of one relationship that had become too entangled with power, reputation, ambition, and pain. And somewhere inside that aftermath, I had let something new begin. That should have made me run. Instead, it made me pay closer attention. By 10:30, my inbox had filled with meeting changes, onboarding follow-ups, a flagged benefits issue, and 1 terse note from legal asking whether I had completed the necessary review chain on the transfer discrepancy I found. I hadn't. Deliberately. Lena had asked me to hold it until she decided how she wanted it traced. That fact should have felt purely procedural. It didn't. It felt like being inside something with her. Even at a distance. Even through paperwork. I hated how much that mattered. I was halfway through drafting a neutral response to legal when my phone vibrated once against the desk. A calendar update. Executive review moved from Thursday to today. Noon. 4th floor boardroom. Attendees included legal, finance, operations, Lena, and me. I read the notice twice. Then a 3rd time. There were legitimate reasons for me to be there. The transfer issue touched staffing and chain of authority concerns. My role made sense. None of that changed the immediate heat that moved through my body when I saw her name beside mine. My breath shifted. Not much. Enough. I leaned back in my chair and shut my eyes for 1 second. Get through the meeting, I told myself. That was all. No private office. No late-night stillness. No charged silence built out of low light and proximity and too much unsaid. Just a boardroom in daylight, with other people present and documents on the table, and enough witnesses to force the world back into order. That should have calmed me. Instead, the idea of seeing her in a room where I had to behave as if none of it existed made my pulse worse. Because once you've been recognized in private, public space becomes its own kind of torture. At 11:53, I walked into the 4th floor boardroom, with my notepad tucked under my arm, and my face arranged into what I hoped looked like composure. The room was long and formal, with heavy molding, tall windows, and a polished table that reflected the overhead lights in softened lines. Someone had already set out water glasses and legal pads at each seat. A tray of coffee sat near the side credenza beside a plate of pastries no one ever really touched in meetings like this. The outside world kept moving. Buses below the windows. The radiator hissing softly beneath the paneling. A phone vibrating once in someone's blazer pocket before being silenced. I chose a seat 2 down from where the CEO packet had been placed. Not beside her. Not across from her. Close enough to participate. Far enough to breathe. Or so I thought. The others arrived in waves. Finance first. Then operations. Then the attorney from compliance. Voices low. Papers shuffling. Chairs adjusting. One man laughed at something too quietly for me to catch. The whole room smelled faintly of toner, coffee, and winter wool. Then Lena walked in, and everything in me answered before I could control it. My body always knew first. The room changed shape in the same subtle way it always did when she entered, but that wasn't what hit me. It was more specific than that now. More dangerous. I knew the exact cadence of her heels across the floor. I knew how her silence felt before she spoke. I knew, with humiliating clarity, the difference between how she carried herself in public and how she had looked the night before with her blazer off and her sleeves rolled. I kept my eyes on the agenda for one full second after she took her seat. Then I looked up. Mistake. She was in a deep navy suit today, tailored so precisely it made restraint look like an art form. Her hair was smooth, pinned back from her face in a way that sharpened her cheekbones. No softness. No visible trace of last night. If someone had told me I imagined every private undertone between us, her expression would have helped them make the case. Then her gaze found mine. Just briefly. A pause so small no one else in the room would have noticed. A question with no words in it. And something in my chest went tight. This was the new reality. Not uncertainty. Not projection. Recognition carried into daylight. The meeting started. Reports. Staffing concerns. Legal contingencies. 2 active projects delayed by permit complications. 1 senior analyst likely to leave if the compensation review wasn't handled carefully. A list of names. A risk matrix. Numbers. Strategy. Real stakes. I contributed when I was asked to contribute. Kept my tone even. Passed over my notes when legal wanted specifics. Every time I spoke, Lena listened with the same precise attention she gave everyone else. Or almost the same. That almost was enough to ruin me. Because she never interrupted me. Because when someone from operations pushed back on my assessment of morale and stability in one division, Lena said, "Let her finish," without raising her voice. Because after that, no one cut me off again. I should have been grateful and professional and nothing more. Instead, warmth climbed slowly under my skin and stayed there. I hated how easily I responded to being protected by her. No, that wasn't honest. I hated how much I liked it. By 12:40, the room had tightened around one question: whether the transfer discrepancy I found was just old system contamination or active manipulation by someone still positioned between firms. Legal wanted process. Finance wanted deniability. Operations wanted the issue buried until there was something concrete enough to survive scrutiny. Lena wanted the truth. You could hear it in how little she said. At one point, the attorney from compliance suggested routing everything through a broader internal review group to avoid the appearance of executive sensitivity. The phrase landed badly. I saw it in Lena's face before I let myself understand why. It wasn't anger exactly. It was sharper than that. The kind of contained response that comes from hearing something manipulative disguised as caution. I spoke before I planned to. That would increase exposure without increasing clarity. Every head turned. The attorney gave me a cool glance. Exposure to whom? I knew I should answer generally. I didn't. To anyone already invested in turning uncertainty into a story? I said. Silence. The words were too close to the truth in more ways than one. The attorney's expression hardened by half a degree. That's a broad category, yes, Lena said calmly, before I had to say anything else. Which is why Emily is right. My name in that room did something dangerous to me. Not because she used it. Because she aligned herself with me so cleanly in front of everyone. It changed the air. Small power shift. Small enough to be deniable. Large enough that I felt it in my pulse and had to look down at my notes to keep my face neutral. The meeting continued. People argued. Timelines were revised. Next steps were assigned. The outside world kept moving. Somewhere near the end, sleet started tapping faintly against the windows. By the time we adjourned, my body felt like it had been braced for impact for over an hour. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped softly back from the table. Folders closed. Water glasses were left half-finished. The attorney from compliance gathered his papers with thin, annoyed efficiency. Operations headed out first. Finance lingered long enough to ask one more question about staffing implications. I stayed seated for one extra second so I wouldn't appear to move when Lena moved. Ridiculous. Ineffective. True. When I stood, she was already at the far end of the table speaking quietly to legal. I kept my eyes on my notes and told myself to leave. Just leave. Walk downstairs. Return to your office. Let the meeting be the meeting and nothing more. Then I heard my name. Emily. I turned before I could stop myself. Lena was looking at me over the edge of a closed folder. Everyone else had nearly cleared the room. Stay a minute. My body reacted before thought. Heat. Stillness. One hard beat at the base of my throat. This was the risk coming back into focus. Social. Personal. Relational. If anyone noticed the timing, the tone, the way I stood there after everyone else had gone, what story would they tell themselves? How quickly would it travel in a building already trained to reading into private conversations? How much of me would survive being reduced to someone's theory about why the CEO's attention had shifted? And the worst part, I stayed anyway. The room emptied in increments. A file box carried out. A half-murmured good afternoon. The door opening, closing. The hum of the radiator returning as the dominant sound once voices were gone. Then, it was just the two of us. Not alone in the same way as her office. Not protected by thick walls and late light. This was worse almost because the boardroom was a public room. A room that belonged to the company. A room where rules lived in plain sight. Lena crossed slowly toward the window end of the table. One hand still resting on the folder she carried. You handled legal well, thank you. You didn't hesitate. I almost laughed, but there was no air for it. I did internally. That changed something in her expression. Not a smile. Something finer than that. A brief fracture in control that let warmth through without making it safe. I know, she said. My breath caught on the quiet certainty of it. Too close. It lived inside the room now. I set my notepad down on the table because my hand needed something to do. Did you want to discuss the review group? In a minute. The answer landed softly. Deliberately. Not work first. Not work only. My pulse turned harder. She stood across from me with the winter light from the windows, drawing a pale line along one side of her face. Close enough now that the rest of the room had gone strangely out of focus. I could still hear the building. Distant footsteps in the corridor, the faint mechanical whir of the elevator bank, a muted voice passing outside the door. But all of it felt secondary to the silence between us. You shouldn't have said that in front of him, she said. For one disorienting second I thought she meant I had overstepped. Then she added, it was too revealing. I looked at her. About the company? Her gaze held mine. About you. The words moved through me like heat. This was the meaningful shift beginning, not because it was dramatic, but because it made the private visible in a new way. She wasn't only acknowledging tension anymore. She was acknowledging what it revealed in me. I forced myself to breathe evenly. I was talking about the situation, yes. The way she said it made the partial truth sound almost tender. I looked away first. Toward the windows. Toward the sleet streaking faintly against the glass. Toward anything that didn't feel like being slowly read by someone I wanted too much. I know how this looks, I said. The sentence was about more than the meeting. We both knew it. Do you? I turned back. There was no cruelty in the question. That made it harder to resist. You think I don't understand the risk, I said. I think you understand it in flashes, Lena said quietly. And then you stand inside them anyway. The line struck so cleanly I went still. Because she was right. That was the internal fracture turning undeniable. I had told myself that my choices were still governed by professionalism, judgment, caution. But what if caution had already stopped being the strongest thing in me where she was concerned? What if I wasn't simply failing to avoid the line? What if some part of me was drawn to the danger of seeing how close I could stand to it without burning? I should have defended myself. Instead I asked, and you don't? Silence. Not empty. Loaded. The kind of silence that forces truth closer to the surface than either person intended. Lena set the folder down. That tiny action changed the room more than it should have. Her hands were free now. My body registered that immediately. A small drop in my stomach. Warmth under my skin. Awareness sharpening until even the sleeve of my blouse brushing my wrist felt magnified. This was where the private moral question rose in me, sudden and sharp and impossible to answer without changing something. Was I really willing to become the kind of woman who reached for what could ruin her just because it finally felt impossible to ignore? I did not answer it. I couldn't. Not with Lena standing there looking at me like restraint was costing her something too. I spent years cleaning personal mistakes out of business decisions, she said at last. I know exactly what it costs when people stop separating the two. There it was. The wound beneath the control. Not fully confessed. Not softened for me. Just there. Something in me shifted toward her before my feet did. Not enough to call movement. Enough to matter. And yet, I said. It was barely a sentence. She heard all of it. And yet, Lena repeated. The words hung there, unfinished and complete at the same time. Outside the boardroom, a cart rolled over the hallway runner with a faint rattling sound. Somewhere downstairs a phone rang and rang before stopping. The outside world continued with almost offensive normalcy, while inside me everything narrowed to her face. Her voice, the impossible steadiness of being looked at by someone who knew what she was withholding. And let me feel it anyway. Emily, she said, and my name in her mouth was no longer neutral. You need to decide whether you want me to make this easier for you. I forgot to breathe, because I understood instantly what she meant. Distance. Coldness. Public formality sharpened into something unmistakable. She could do it. Of course she could. She could shut every door I had started opening in myself. She could make the building feel hostile again instead of charged. She could return us both to safety if she chose to be ruthless enough. And the truth arrived so fast it frightened me. I didn't want easier. That realization changed how I saw myself. Until that second, I had still been able to imagine I was the responsible one in this story. The younger one, yes. The less powerful one, absolutely. But still the one capable of being led back toward good judgment if the stronger person demanded it. Except now she was giving me the possibility of retreat. And I didn't want it. I looked at her and understood with a kind of terrible clarity that part of me wanted the difficulty. The tension. The waiting. The knowledge that every room we shared would ask something of me I was no longer strong enough to refuse cleanly. No, I said. Just that. It left my mouth before I could soften it. Lena went still. The room went still with her. That one syllable was not a confession. Not a request. Not permission. It was worse. It was an answer. My own answer, heard aloud for the first time. Something changed in her face then. Very slight. A shift in the line of her mouth. A visible effort to contain something that might have become a different expression in a different life. I felt suddenly, painfully aware of how close we were standing in a room we should have left minutes ago. The risk sharpened again. If someone opened the door now. If someone came back for a folder. If legal re-entered to ask one more question and found the two of us suspended in this silence. What would the scene say before either of us spoke? How would I explain my face? My stillness? The fact that nothing had happened and everything had? Lena took one step toward me. Not enough to touch. Enough that the air changed. My breath failed me completely, then came back too fast. This was the almost kiss long before either of us moved like it might become one. Not because our mouths were close. They weren't. Not yet. It was in the structure of the moment. The pressure of the unchosen. The unbearable fact that my whole body had tilted toward possibility while the rest of the company went on existing a few feet beyond the walls. I could smell the faint, dry warmth of her perfume again beneath the colder scent of the room. "Do you know what you're saying?" she asked. The question should have restored my caution. Instead, it stripped it. Because what I heard underneath it was not disbelief. It was strain. I swallowed. Enough. Her eyes moved once to my mouth and back. That was all. It was enough to send heat through me so fast, I had to grip the edge of the table behind me to keep my hands from betraying me. Controlled stillness. Nothing physically happening. 5 seconds. Maybe less. Long enough that I could hear the sleet at the windows again. Long enough that I knew if she touched me right then, even just my wrist, my face, the back of my hand, I would not stop this. That knowledge hit me with humiliating force. Not as fantasy. As fact. I was not standing there wondering what I wanted anymore. I knew. And I knew it in the most dangerous way possible, through my body first, and with enough certainty that my thoughts were no longer leading. Lena saw it. I don't know how. In my breath. In the tension in my shoulders. In the way I had gone perfectly still, except for the hand gripping the table edge too tightly. But she saw it, and the look that crossed her face then was so brief and human it nearly undid me. Want. Restraint. Grief for something already becoming impossible. Then the corridor outside the boardroom erupted into movement. A burst of footsteps, 2 voices, the sound of the door handle shifting once from the outside, before whoever it was realized, the room was occupied, and moved on. The moment shattered. Not fully. Just enough. Lena stepped back first. Again. The distance reappeared between us like a wound sealed too quickly. I let go of the table and only then realized how hard I had been holding it. My fingertips had gone pale. I curled them once into my palm, trying to restore feeling. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then Lena picked up the folder again, the motion exact, controlled, almost surgical in its precision. "We'll keep the review narrow," she said. Business voice. Not cold. Worse. Carefully restored. I stared at her. This was the consequence of restraint chosen consciously. Not relief. Not safety. A new kind of ache. The knowledge that we had both reached the edge of something and pulled back not because it wasn't there, but because it was. I nodded. Okay. My voice sounded different to me. Older, maybe. Or just less innocent. That was the final shift. Small from the outside. Irreversible from within. I had walked into the boardroom still imagining that desire might be something happening to me. Something I could manage by staying alert and disciplined and professional enough for both of us. I was leaving with the knowledge that I had answered for myself. No, I didn't want easier. And once you know that about yourself, you don't get to go back to being the person who didn't. Lena moved toward the door and opened it for me. Such a formal gesture. Such a devastating one. I walked past her with every nerve in my body, aware of how little space existed between us, and how much effort it was costing both of us not to close it. She did not touch me. I did not turn my head. The corridor outside was cooler, brighter, brutally normal. Someone from finance was standing near the elevator talking into a phone. A junior associate hurried past carrying a stack of binders. Life. Company. Work. Everyone still moving inside the same building where, seconds earlier, I had nearly tilted my face up and ruined everything. I should have felt grateful that I hadn't. Instead, I felt hollowed out by the fact that I had wanted to. I took the stairs down instead of the elevator because I needed movement. The heavy door closed behind me with a muted thud, and the stairwell air smelled faintly of dust, metal, and old heat. My heels struck the steps too sharply. Halfway down, I had to stop with one hand on the railing and force myself to take one full breath, then another. My body was still trying to catch up. At my floor, the day resumed around me as if nothing had changed. A coordinator asked whether I'd reviewed a benefits escalation. Someone left a voicemail about onboarding materials. My inbox filled with follow-ups from the meeting. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen until the cursor blinked at me like a private accusation. What had nearly happened in that boardroom wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a passing spark. It wasn't just her, or just me, or just timing, or just loneliness, or just admiration shaped into something more dangerous by proximity. It was mutual. And I knew it now. That should have made me wiser. Instead, it made every part of the day feel sharper and less stable. The coffee cup warming my palm. The copy machine jamming in the hallway. The wet cuffs of someone's trousers after coming in from the sleet. My own reflection, briefly caught in the black screen before a document opened, looking back at me with a face I recognized and didn't. I looked the same. I was not the same. A little after 5, while the office began its slow evening exhale, I opened a draft email to legal about the narrowed review process and found myself unable to type the first sentence. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because all at once I could see too clearly the double life already forming inside ordinary things. One version of me wrote policies, reviewed transfer chains, attended executive meetings, and kept her voice steady. The other knew exactly how Lena's eyes had dropped to my mouth before she stepped back. Those two selves were beginning to occupy the same body without blending. That was the suspension I couldn't escape by the end of the day. Not release. Not resolution. Just the unbearable coexistence of function and desire. When I finally shut my laptop, the office had gone dim. My desk lamp cast its greenish light over a stack of untouched notes. Outside the narrow window, Chicago glowed wet and metallic in the dark. Somewhere above me, faint through the old structure of the building, a door closed. I went still. For one irrational second, every part of me listened as if it could tell whether it was hers. I made it through the rest of that day by becoming mechanical. Not calm. Not detached. Just precise enough to keep myself from splintering in public. I answered emails. Revised the review memo. Took one call from benefits. Deferred another from legal until the next morning because my voice was too thin and I knew it. At one point I stood in the copy room feeding the same page into the machine twice because I had forgotten I'd already made the first copy. No one noticed. Or if they did, they were kind enough not to say anything. The building kept moving around me with the same indifferent rhythm it always had. Doors opening and closing. A cart rolling over the hallway runner. Someone laughing too loudly and accounting before remembering where they were and dropping their voice. My coffee going cold. Again. Real life? That was the problem now. Real life hadn't paused to make space for what had happened in the boardroom. No one had dimmed the lights. No music had swelled. There had been no kiss, no touch, no cinematic collapse into consequence. Just a few unbearable seconds. A look. A step. A silence I still felt inside my skin hours later. And because nothing visible had happened, I had no clean place to put it. No event to blame. No action to regret outright. Just a version of myself I could no longer pretend not to know. The woman who had been given an exit and didn't want it. By the time I finally left, Chicago had gone slick and dark under a fine winter mist that silvered the sidewalks and made every streetlight look softer than it really was. I walked faster than I needed to, my bag heavy against my shoulder, my breath visible in short pale bursts every time I exhaled. A bus sighed at the curb. A cyclist went past with a delivery pack strapped to his back. Somewhere behind me, a siren moved through traffic and kept going. I wanted noise. I wanted distance. I wanted my own apartment, my own walls, my own stupid kettle, and my half-dead kitchen plant, and the sweater I always wore when I needed to feel like no one could see me. What I did not want was silence, because silence now had her in it. When I got home, I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door and immediately missed. They hit the floor with a sharp metallic sound and skidded under the console table. I stared at them for a second without bending down. That was how I knew I was more shaken than I wanted to admit. I was usually careful at home. Exact in the small ways people become when they live alone and know that order is sometimes the only witness to how hard they're trying. I kicked off my shoes, hung my coat, put water on to boil. Then I stood in the middle of my kitchen while the kettle warmed and understood with sick clarity that there was nowhere left to hide from myself. Not in work. Not in movement. Not even here. My apartment was warm in the dry, imperfect way old Chicago apartments always are in winter, radiator heat that made the air a little too thin, the windows rattling faintly whenever the wind pushed hard enough, the smell of dust and tea and detergent in the fabric of everything. The lamp beside the sofa cast a soft circle of amber over the coffee table, where 2 unopened mailers and a magazine I hadn't read yet were waiting exactly where I'd left them. Ordinary life. Small life. Mine. And still, the first thing my body did when I set my bag down was replay the boardroom. Her saying, "You need to decide whether you want me to make this easier for you." My own voice answering, "No." I leaned both hands against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. What kind of answer had that been? Not brave. Not innocent. Not smart. It had been honest. And that was somehow the most dangerous thing about it. The kettle clicked off behind me. I didn't move. For 1 long second, maybe 2, I let myself stay there in pure feeling without trying to improve it or analyze it or turn it into language tidy enough to survive. Heat in my chest, a hollow ache beneath it. The memory of wanting so strong it felt like grief. Then I opened my eyes, made tea I didn't really want, and carried it to the sofa where I sat curled under a blanket, staring at nothing while my phone lit up twice, with messages I didn't answer right away. One from my sister, asking if I was still coming Saturday. One from my friend Claire, who sent, "Tell me your new job isn't already turning you into a corporate ghost." I almost laughed. Instead I typed, "I'm fine. Just tired." That was the other thing I was beginning to understand. Desire doesn't only make you reckless. Sometimes it makes you a liar in tiny, efficient ways. I slept badly. Not because I dreamed anything dramatic. No vivid fantasy. No feverish replay. It was worse than that. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep with my body never fully unclenching, waking every few hours to the red numbers of the clock and the muffled city noise outside, and the same humiliating awareness that none of this had faded while I was unconscious. At 3:17 I woke up remembering the precise angle of Lena's face when she looked at my mouth. At 4:42, I woke because I had turned over and my own heartbeat felt too high. By 6, I gave up and got out of bed. The next morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than necessary, rejecting 3 blouses before choosing one that was high-necked cream, almost severe. I told myself it was because the weather had turned colder. That was not the reason. The reason was that I no longer trusted my own body to feel neutral around her, so I was dressing for containment. That should have embarrassed me. It did. It just didn't stop me. The building was quieter than usual when I arrived. The lobby washed in pale winter light that made the stone floors look colder and the brass less warm. A security guard I'd only spoken to twice nodded at me as I passed. The receptionist was arranging fresh flowers in a low bowl by the desk. White lilies, a little too elegant for an office, their scent faint but unmistakable in the air. It hit me before I could stop it. The fragrance wasn't hers. Not really. But there was something in the dry floral note. Something restrained and expensive that made my stomach dip anyway. My body reacted before I could explain it. Again. I hated how fast that had become normal. I was halfway to the elevator when someone called my name. Emily. I turned, still holding my coffee, and saw one of the legal assistants hurrying toward me with a file in hand. She asked a question about the narrowed review process. I answered it. She nodded, thanked me, moved on. Nothing important. Except that for one irrational second before I turned, some part of me had already expected the voice to be Lena's. The realization made me feel abruptly younger than 24, which I hated even more than the desire. By 10 o'clock, the day had acquired texture. Meetings. A benefits escalation. A difficult conversation with a project coordinator who was considering leaving for a more stable environment, which she said with visible apology, as if instability had become something everyone in the building was embarrassed to speak aloud. I reassured her, asked practical questions, took notes with steady hands. That was what I was good at. People. Listening when they were trying not to say the real thing. Reading what fear did to language. Maybe that was why none of this felt survivable. Because the person most impossible to misread at that point was me. A little after 11, my phone buzzed once on my desk with a calendar notification. No meeting. No formal request. Just a message routed through the internal system from Lena's assistant. CEO requests updated retention projections at 12:30. Delivered directly. I stared at the screen until the message timed out and dimmed. Then I read it again. Delivered directly. There was nothing inherently strange about that. The numbers had shifted after the previous day's boardroom decisions. My department owned part of the update. Lena often asked for things herself when timing mattered. That was the professional explanation. The other explanation sat underneath it like heat under stone. She could have asked for it by email. She hadn't. This was the pressure topic 4 needed to become something different. Though at the time it just felt like my pulse going too fast under my skin, while the rest of my office stayed brutally ordinary. Someone in payroll sneezed in the hall. A stapler clicked at the desk behind mine. My coffee had finally gone cold enough that a pale ring formed near the inside edge of the lid. I got up and walked to the restroom just to breathe alone for 30 seconds. The mirror didn't help. I looked composed. Too composed, maybe. Cream blouse. Hair pinned back. Small gold hoops. Mouth set in that careful line I used when I was trying not to let my face reveal anything before I'd chosen it. I touched cool water to my wrists and looked at my reflection. What was I doing? That question had started living inside me with new force since the boardroom. Not as panic. Not as innocence. As a private measure of damage. Every time I thought I had regained control, I found another place where control had become performance. By noon, the retention packet was ready. I reviewed it twice, corrected one line in the third quarter attrition summary, reprinted the first page because I hated how one paragraph break fell, and slid the papers into a navy folder that looked more formal than I felt. At 12:26, I took the stairs instead of the elevator. I told myself it was because the elevator was slow around lunch. That was partly true. It was also because I needed the extra 20 seconds to assemble myself before I saw her. The executive floor was quieter at midday than late afternoon, stripped of most incidental noise. The assistant desk was staffed, but the phones weren't ringing. One office door stood open, revealing a senior analyst eating salad over a spreadsheet. Farther down the corridor, someone was speaking in low-clipped tones I couldn't make out. Lena's assistant looked up when I approached. "She's expecting you," she said, then paused. Her 1 o'clock canceled, so you can just go in. My stomach tightened. Of course it did. I thanked her and walked toward the office with the folder against my palm. The door was closed. Not unusual. Not dramatic. Still, the sight of it sent a clear line of awareness through me. I knocked once. "Come in." Her voice traveled through the wood and into my body before the meaning of the word registered. I opened the door and stepped inside. First thing I noticed was the light. Not evening light this time, not low and intimate and dangerous in the obvious ways. Midday winter light. Pale and restrained through the tall windows, softening the edges of the room instead of deepening them. It made everything look cleaner. Less forgiving. The old wood of the desk. The leather chairs. The framed architectural drawings. The city beyond the glass, distant and cold. Lena stood near the window with one hand tucked into the pocket of her slacks, her jacket off again, the sleeves of her ivory blouse rolled once at the forearms. A cup of untouched coffee sat on the side table beside her. There was no one else in the room. No open laptop. No meeting already in progress. Just her. And me. The click of the door closing behind me sounded much louder than it probably was. Too close. Came back immediately. "Emily," she said. Just my name. But something in the way she said it made the room feel smaller. I crossed to the desk and set the folder down. "Updated projections." "Thank you." She didn't reach for it right away. That was the first thing that shifted the air. The second was that she kept looking at me while she said it. Not in a hard way. Not interrogating. Just sustained enough that my breath changed and my fingers loosened on the folder a half-second too late, making the papers inside slightly out of place. I corrected them too quickly. A tiny thing. Still a tell. Lena noticed. Of course she noticed. "You didn't sleep much," she said. The line was quiet. Not a question. Heat climbed up my neck so fast it felt almost adolescent, and I hated the feeling on sight. "No," I said, because anything more polished would have sounded false. Her gaze lowered for the briefest second, not to my mouth this time but to my hand still resting on the edge of the folder, then came back to my eyes. Neither did I. The room changed. Not because the words were intimate by themselves. They weren't. Two adults acknowledging a bad night. That was all. Except it wasn't all. Because it was the first thing she had said to me that belonged entirely outside business. And because she said it without any protective layer around it at all. I felt it physically. A slow, unmistakable warmth moving under my skin. The kind that begins in the chest and makes the rest of the body feel less trustworthy. There was the private space vulnerability. No spectacle. No confession that rewrote the world in one blow. Just the devastating simple fact of knowing the previous day had stayed with her too. I should have looked away. I didn't. "Then maybe we both need better judgment," I said softly. I meant it as half defense, half warning. Lena's mouth shifted by the smallest degree. Not amusement. Recognition of the nerve it took to say it. "Maybe." Silence settled between us. The office held silence differently than any other room in the building. More completely. The soundproofing did something almost unnerving to the air, cutting away the incidental noises that might otherwise have broken the spell of a moment. I could still hear the radiator ticking faintly near the side wall, could still hear the muted pulse of the city through old glass if I paid attention hard enough. But mostly, what I heard was the space between our breathing. That was its own form of pressure. Lena stepped closer to the desk and finally opened the folder. She scanned the first page quickly, eyes moving with the precision I already associated with her. For a minute or two the room became functional again. Questions about projected departures. One note about compensation strategy. A brief discussion of which language from the boardroom should be softened before distribution. We worked. Really worked. And somehow that made it worse. Because functional competence with her had become one of the most intimate things in my life. At one point she leaned beside me to read a line I'd marked, and the clean, dry scent of her perfume reached me before any part of her touched me. She didn't touch me. Her sleeve brushed the desk near my hand, nothing more. My pulse reacted like it had. That was the cruelty of it now. My body had started translating proximity into memory so efficiently that even restraint felt like contact. Lena straightened slightly and looked at the paragraph again. "This section needs changing. I know. You left it. I wanted you to see it before I revised it." She turned to me then. Direct look. Dark, steady, impossible to soften by pretending I hadn't meant what I'd just admitted. You wanted my reaction first. It wasn't a question. I could have lied. I could have said I wanted executive approval on tone before distribution, which was true enough to use as cover. That was always the danger, wasn't it? There were still plausible versions of every choice available to me, and each one made it easier to stay near the truth without naming it. Instead I said, yes. Another fault line. Small. Sharp. Deliberate. The consequences of the boardroom were no longer theoretical after that. Something in me had stopped scrambling to hide itself completely. Not because I felt safe. Because I was tired of pretending the risk only existed on one side of the room. Lena's fingers rested on the edge of the paper. Still. Precise. You make that difficult, for you? The question escaped before I could improve it. Her eyes did not leave mine. Yes. There it was. Not ornate. Not cinematic in the way people imagine these things when they haven't actually lived them. No declaration. No step forward. No sudden surrender. Just one clean answer that rearranged the pressure in the room. The emotional exposure of it went through me like a live current. After that, every ordinary detail sharpened. The faint steam lifting from her coffee even though she hadn't touched it. The slight crease near the cuff of her rolled sleeve. The old city light at the edge of the desk. My own heartbeat, too fast to ignore and too steady to call panic. This was where fear of loss first became real. Not loss of a relationship we didn't yet have. Loss of the possibility itself. The knowledge that whatever was happening between us had finally crossed into a form that could be withdrawn, protected against, shut down. And because it could be lost, it had suddenly become precious in a way I hadn't permitted before. What do you want from me? I asked. I hadn't meant to say it aloud. The second it left my mouth, I felt the room go very still. Not because the question was dramatic. Because it was too honest. Lena looked at me as if the answer existed, as if she had already lived with it alone longer than I had. That was the unbearable part. Then she said, quietly, "That's not the right question." I could feel heat in my face now, under my skin, behind my ribs. Then what is? She let out one breath. Controlled. Not easy. Whether you understand what asking it changes. There was the moral dilemma, clean and impossible. Not whether I wanted her. Not whether she wanted me. We already knew enough to stop lying about that to ourselves. The question was whether I would become the kind of person who pushed us past the point where denial could still protect us both. I didn't answer immediately. For one suspended stretch of seconds, nothing happened. The plot did not move. The folder stayed open. The coffee remained untouched. Outside the windows, traffic kept threading through Chicago as if none of this mattered. But inside that stillness, I felt myself changing. Because I realized with a kind of painful calm that I wasn't only afraid of what crossing the line would cost. I was afraid of how much it would matter to me if she decided not to. That was new. That was worse. Lena must have seen something in my face because the next thing she said was softer than anything she'd given me before. Emily. Just that. Yet it landed like concern. And concern from her was almost more intimate than desire. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was claiming to know. Maybe only this. That I was already too deep inside the emotional version of this to pretend otherwise. She moved then, slowly, carefully, around the corner of the desk. Not an abrupt approach. Not the kind of movement that could be mistaken for impulse. Intentional. Measured. A choice. My body answered before I did. Breath shallower. Spine more alert. Heat pooling low and steady in a way that made standing still feel like effort. She stopped close enough that the silence became physical. Not touching. Never accidentally. The air between us felt deliberate now. I should make this simple, Lena said. You could, yes. But you're not. Her gaze shifted once, not downward, not away, just enough to reveal strain before it disappeared again. No. The word was quiet. Barely more than breath. It changed everything anyway. Because it was surrender and retreat at the same time. Not I can't. Not I won't. Just the devastating truth that simplicity was still available to her, and she was choosing not to take it. I had no business feeling relieved by that. I did. The relief hurt. That was the worst part. It arrived braided with fear so tightly I couldn't separate them. Fear of loss. Fear of being seen. Fear of wanting something I had now begun to understand I might not survive losing cleanly. I think Lena saw that too. Her hand lifted. Not quickly. Slow enough that I watched it happen with my whole body. For one impossible second I thought she was going to touch my face. Instead, her fingers stopped near my shoulder, just barely catching the loose strand of hair that had slipped free near my collar. She brushed it back with the lightest contact imaginable. Consent-based. Minimal. Thought one. Nothing graphic, nothing even obviously intimate to an outside eye. And yet the moment her fingertips touched me, every coherent thought I had disappeared. A tiny touch. That changed everything. My skin reacted first. A bright, immediate awareness blooming from that one point of contact, and running downward in a line I couldn't control. My breath left me all at once. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough that I knew she heard it. Lena's hand stilled for the briefest second near my shoulder before she let it fall. We both felt that. No one could have called it accidental. I didn't move. I couldn't. The office had gone so silent, I could hear my pulse in my ears. The city outside the windows might as well have vanished. Even the radiator seemed to stop speaking. This was not a kiss. It was somehow crueler. Because it was enough. Enough to make desire undeniable in my body. Enough to prove she knew exactly what she was doing. Enough to leave both of us standing on the edge of something without the mercy of falling. An internal fracture became undeniable then. Not just that I wanted her, but that I wanted to be touched by her in ways I would never again be able to call abstract or harmless or manageable. That one small gesture had rewritten the scale of everything. I saw myself differently in that second. Not as someone tempted. As someone already altered. There was a private question waiting under my heartbeat then, sharp and unanswerable. If one brief touch could undo me this thoroughly, what would I become if I ever let her give me more? I didn't answer it. I think the silence answered enough. Lena drew back first. Not far. Just enough to let the moment keep burning instead of consuming us whole. Her voice, when it came, was low enough that I felt it more than heard it. This is exactly the problem. I almost laughed from the strain of it. Not because anything was funny. Because the understatement was unbearable. Yes. That was all I could manage. The external pressure arrived a second later in the form of a knock at the outer door. Not this office door, the assistant's door beyond it. Muffled by the soundproofing but clear enough to break the stillness. We both went rigid. Reality rushed back in fragments. The building. The company. The fact that there were people only yards away. That someone might walk in with papers or a scheduling question or a routine interruption and find us standing there with my skin still carrying the memory of her hand. Lena stepped away immediately. That movement hurt more than it should have. She reached for the folder on the desk, the gesture precise again, control restored so quickly it almost felt cruel until I recognized it for what it was. Protection. For both of us. Come back to this section after legal reviews, the narrowed language, she said, already back inside business tone. I understood. Of course I did. I also understood that the return to professionalism wasn't false. That was the tragedy of it. This wasn't pretense replacing truth. It was truth being forced to wear armor. I nodded. Okay. My voice sounded thinner than I wanted. From the outer office came the faint murmur of her assistant speaking to someone. A name I didn't catch. The rustle of papers. Normal office life resuming with all the indifference of a machine that never cares what human beings are suffering inside it. Lena didn't look at me again right away. She marked one line on the report with her pen, then set it down too carefully, as if that small act of precision was the only thing keeping the room balanced. Finally, she said, without lifting her eyes, "You should go before someone needs me." The line was practical. The ache it caused was not. I gathered the folder too quickly and nearly bent one corner. Corrected it. Hated that she probably saw my hands weren't steady. She saw everything. At the door, I stopped. Not because I meant to. Because some part of me still couldn't accept leaving in the middle of that kind of silence as if the world remained unchanged. When I turned back, Lena was looking at me. Not guarded. Not open either. Something in between. Something more fragile than I had ever seen on her face. It nearly undid me. "Did you mean it?" I asked before caution could reach me. The question should have made no sense out of context, but both of us knew exactly what it meant. Not the touch. Not only that. The know us. The refusal of simplicity. The admission that difficulty had been chosen. Lena held my gaze for one long second, then another. Yes. No embellishment. No rescue. Just truth. That one word followed me out of the office like heat. The assistant looked up when I emerged, asked if Lena had the revisions she needed. I said yes, kept my voice even, walked back down the corridor with the folder against my chest, and every inch of my skin aware of the place on my shoulder where Lena's fingers had touched me. The outside world continued moving. Someone laughed near the stairwell. An elevator opened with a soft bell. A junior associate passed me carrying lunch in a paper bag, apologizing when she had to shift around my path. None of it reached me fully. I took the stairs again. Halfway down, I had to stop with one hand against the wall, because the delayed force of the moment was finally catching up to me. Not panic. Not weakness. Just the body refusing to pretend it had not been changed by what happened. I touched my own shoulder. Stupid, maybe. But I needed to know whether the heat there was real or only memory. It was both. Back at my desk, I worked for another 3 hours in a state I can only describe as carefully inhabited. Every movement felt slightly delayed, as if I were operating one layer above myself while something more honest remained deeper down, still in her office. Still in that silence after the touch. The connection between us was no longer built only on implication. It had weight now. Not enough to call it an affair. Not enough to call it a mistake in the obvious sense. Just enough that I knew the next thing, whatever it was, would matter more than either of us could safely afford. That was the unstable equilibrium forming by the end of the day. Not peace. Not distance. Fragile arrangement made of restraint, truth, and one touch too small to defend against. At 6:20, as the office around me began to empty, my computer chimed with an internal memo alert. Legal had finalized the narrowed review language. I opened it, scanned the revisions, and found the sentence Lena had marked earlier now, rewritten almost exactly the way I knew she wanted it. Efficient. Clean. Controlled. I stared at the line for too long. Because hidden beneath all that control was a simple fact I could no longer escape. She had touched me, and then returned to the language of caution without denying any of it. That should have grounded me. Instead, it left me suspended in something worse than chaos. Hope. When I finally shut down my computer and stood, the building had gone dim around the edges again. Evening gathering in the old stone. Lights softening behind half-closed doors. Somewhere above me, beyond the floors and corridors and executive offices I had learned too quickly to navigate by instinct, there was a woman who had chosen difficulty, and had asked me to leave before someone came in. I didn't know whether that meant she was protecting me, or herself, or both. I only knew that when I stepped out into the Chicago cold, and the wind caught at my coat, the place on my shoulder, where she had touched me, still felt warmer than the rest of my skin. And that fragile warmth felt far too dangerous to trust. By Friday, the building had learned how to hurt me in smaller ways. Not with anything dramatic. Nothing that would have looked like suffering from the outside. Just 100 ordinary things that had started carrying her shape inside them. The hush before a meeting began. The sound of heels crossing marble 2 floors above me. A coffee left untouched for too long. The cold brass of a door handle under my palm. Even the silence had changed. It no longer felt neutral. It felt inhabited. I kept working. Of course I did. There was too much happening inside the company for anyone to afford distraction, least of all me. Legal had begun the narrowed review. 2 division heads were quietly at odds over reporting chains that used to run cleanly through both founding partners. Rumors about the rival firm had started moving faster than facts. In one conversation before noon, a coordinator asked me, too casually, whether executive leadership felt stable now. I answered the way I was supposed to. Measured. Professional. Precise. But the word stayed with me long after she left my office. Stable. I almost laughed. Nothing about me felt stable anymore. I was becoming 2 women at once. The one who sat across from employees and spoke clearly about process, discretion, morale, retention. And the one who felt heat rise in her throat every time Lena's name appeared in a calendar invite. The one who could still hear that soft, devastating yes from her office like it had lodged somewhere beneath my ribs and refused to leave. The worst part was that I had stopped being surprised by my own body. It knew her now. Not in the abstract. Not the way you know a person because they've become important in theory. I knew the cadence of her presence. The pressure change in a room before I looked up and found her there. The difference between the voice she used in public and the quieter one she used only when something cost her. Too close, I thought once around 1 in the afternoon while I was reviewing benefits allocations, and heard a door close on the executive floor. Then almost immediately after, not close enough. That was new. That was the transformed version of the phrase, and it frightened me more than the original ever had. Because warnings can still save you. Need cannot. By 3, the sky outside had gone white, with gathering snow. The city softening under a flat winter light that made the building feel older, more sealed in, as if the whole downtown had tightened its shoulders against the weather. The windows in my office showed only a sliver of it, but I could feel the storm coming in the faint pressure behind the glass and the subtle restlessness moving through the floors. People wanted to get home before the roads got worse. Voices were shorter. The elevator took longer. My inbox filled with reschedule requests and notes marked Monday instead of end of day. The outside world kept moving. Inside me, something else was waiting. At 3:37, my phone buzzed against the desk. No calendar alert this time. A direct internal message. Need the final retention language before board circulation. My office. When you can. I stared at the screen without moving. Not because the message was unusual. Because it was. The wording was businesslike. It would have looked harmless to anyone else. It was exactly the kind of note a CEO might send to a department lead on a tight timeline. But there was one phrase in it that shifted the ground anyway. When you can. Not now. Not immediately. Not a command. Room. Choice. That was crueler than pressure. For one long second, I sat there with my hand resting on the edge of my desk and let the truth rise without trying to edit it. I wanted to go. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to see her. Because after days of controlled silence, of public professionalism sharpened almost to pain, some part of me had begun to ache with the effort of not standing in the same room as her and letting the truth breathe. I could have replied with the language by email. I knew that. I could have had my assistant send the folder upstairs. I knew that too. Instead I wrote, "I'll bring it up in 10. The message sent. And with it, something inside me settled, not into calm exactly, but into decision. That was the thing no one tells you about crossing internal lines. Sometimes the worst of it isn't the crossing. It's the relief. The next 10 minutes moved with strange clarity. I finalized the edits. Printed the revised pages. Smoothed them once against the desk, though they didn't need smoothing. Closed my laptop. Put the papers in a dark folder I had no real reason to choose over the others, except that it looked more formal, and formality still felt like armor. Then I stood, slipped on my coat, because the upper floors always ran colder by late afternoon, and took the stairs. The building felt different in snow. Quieter. Heavier. The windows in the stairwell had gone cloudy with fine white accumulation at the edges. And somewhere in the walls old heat ticked steadily through the pipes. My own footsteps sounded too distinct on the stairs. At the landing between floors, I stopped once with one hand on the rail and looked out through the narrow pane of glass at the city beginning to vanish into the weather. Chicago in winter has a way of making everything feel both more intimate and more merciless. Streets half erased. Headlights blurred. The horizon hidden before evening even arrives. I thought with sudden and ridiculous clarity that if there were ever a day for bad decisions, it was this one. Then I kept going. The executive floor was nearly empty. One assistant was zipping a laptop into a bag behind the front desk. A junior analyst hurried out of a side office with her coat half on and her phone tucked between shoulder and ear, already talking to someone about traffic. The world was shutting down early. Lena's assistant looked up as I approached. "She's still in," she said. "Everyone else is heading out." I nodded once. My pulse had already started moving differently. At the door, I paused only long enough to knock. "Come in." I stepped inside. The room held winter light in a way evening never could. Snow-muted brightness, pale and diffuse, turning the city beyond the windows into something almost abstract. White air, blurred towers, moving lights below. Lena's office looked at once larger and more private than usual, as if the storm had sealed it away from the rest of the building. She was standing near the far side of the desk. One hand braced lightly against the wood. Jacket on this time. Dark hair smooth. Expression composed in that exacting way I had come to understand meant she was holding herself together on purpose. The moment she saw me, something in her face changed. Not openly. But enough. I closed the door behind me. The sound of it settling into place echoed softly through the room. No one outside could hear us. The act moved through me with bright, immediate force. I set the folder down on the desk and slid it toward her. Final language. Thank you. Her fingers touched the edge of the folder at the same moment mine let go. Not my hand. Not even close. Still, my body registered the nearness as if it had. Lena opened the file and read. I stood across from her trying to look at the pages and not at her mouth. Her hands the line of fatigue at the edge of her eyes that had become more visible over the last 2 days. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hiss of the radiator and, every once in a while, the soft, irregular tap of snow against the window. Real weather. Real work. Real danger. She turned the last page. This is right. I thought so. You still changed the second paragraph. I met her eyes. Because I knew you'd want it cleaner. A silence followed that should have been simple and wasn't. Pressure had changed again. Not as sharp as the boardroom. Not as raw as the moment in her office when she touched my shoulder. Something deeper now. Less frantic. More difficult to escape. Lena closed the folder slowly, then let one hand rest on top of it. Emily, she said, and I could tell from the first note of my name that this was no longer about language. My breath changed before I could control it. Yes. She looked at me for one suspended second, maybe 2, as if measuring the cost of the next thing before she chose it. I've spent the entire day deciding whether I was going to ask you to stay or ask you to leave. The words went through me like heat. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were honest. There was no armor on them. No executive precision. No clean route back to business. Outside, the city was disappearing into snow. Inside, my pulse had become impossible to ignore. And? I asked quietly. Her gaze held mine. I still don't know which would be kinder. That was the moment I understood that whatever ending this was moving toward, it would not be built on impulse. It would be built on consequence. Because kindness had entered the room. And kindness is far more dangerous than desire when what you want can ruin you. I took one slow breath. Do you want kindness? For the first time in days, maybe the first time since I met her, Lena let silence expose her before she fixed it. The answer lived on her face for just a fraction too long. No. Not exactly. Not for me. I stepped closer before I had fully decided to. Not enough to make contact. Enough to make the distance matter. My body had stopped waiting for permission to understand what she did to me. I felt it everywhere now. Pulse, breath, warmth under my skin. The strange steadiness that comes when fear and want stop fighting and begin to stand side by side. Lena watched me come closer and did not move away. There was the mutual recognition, not new in itself, final in the way it settled. I should go, I said. The sentence was true. Also a test. Her eyes darkened slightly. Yes. Still neither of us moved. That isn't what you want, I said. No. The word landed without hesitation this time. A quiet continuation might have been possible until then. More days of silence. More near moments. More careful damage done slowly enough that either of us could still pretend we were being strong. But once she said no like that, we both knew the shape of the lie had changed. I heard myself ask, almost before I knew I meant to, "Then what do you want?" The room held still around us. The city held still. Even the snow seemed to have muffled the world into waiting. Lena's voice, when it came, was low enough that I felt it in my chest. I want one honest thing before I choose the rest of my life around being careful. It was such a devastating sentence that for a second I forgot how to breathe. One honest thing. Not forever. Not promise. Not the reckless fantasy version of this where desire solves power, timing, history, consequence. Just honesty. And somehow that was harder to refuse than anything else could have been. I looked at her and knew exactly what was at risk. My job. Her position. The company already fraying under old wounds. Every whisper in the building, waiting for new material. Every future room that might become impossible to walk into without memory sitting between us. I knew all of it. And still the truest thing in me rose first. So do I said. Another small shift. Irreversible. Lena took one step toward me. This time I met her there. No one teaches you how much can happen before a kiss. The air changes. Time stops behaving normally. Your body becomes both sharper and less reliable. Every detail grows unnaturally vivid, the faint bitter scent of coffee gone untouched on the side table, the soft gleam of snowlight against the desk, the precise angle of her shoulders, the way my own hand tightened once around nothing, and then loosened. Too close, I thought. Then, almost at the same instant, at last, the transformed phrase settled inside me with a clarity that felt like surrender. Lena lifted her hand slowly. I could have stopped her. That mattered. It mattered that she moved as if the answer still belonged to me. It mattered that I stayed. It mattered that when her fingers reached my face, brushing once along my jaw with such care it nearly undid me, I leaned into the touch before I could stop myself. Consent lives in small things too. In the way my eyes closed for half a second and opened again. In the way I stepped nearer instead of back. In the way my mouth parted on a breath that was not fear. Lena's gaze dropped once to my mouth and rose again, giving me one last quiet chance to refuse what my whole body had already agreed to. I didn't refuse. When she kissed me, it was not sudden. That was the first mercy. It was slow, careful, almost restrained at first, as if both of us were still honoring the edge even while crossing it. The touch of her mouth to mine felt less like impact and more like recognition finally allowed to become physical. Warmth. Gravity. A slow loss of control that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with truth. I felt it everywhere. In the hand that came up to the front of her coat and stayed there, fingers curling lightly into the fabric because I needed to hold on to something. In the sharp, bright rush beneath my skin when she kissed me again, still careful, and the care itself made it more intimate, not less. In the unbearable tenderness of the silence around us. No music, no interruption, just the storm outside, and the two of us inside a room that had seen too many negotiations, and finally held one neither of us could speak through. It was not hunger in the crude sense. It was ache answered. It was all the withheld things in us finding one place to land. Lena's hand moved from my jaw to the side of my neck, not possessive, just steady, as if she was feeling my pulse there and understanding exactly what she had done. I think I made a sound. Small, breath soft, nothing I could have repeated later without blushing alone in my apartment. Her mouth paused at that, forehead coming lightly to mine, and for a few impossible seconds neither of us moved at all. Controlled stillness. Except now it didn't feel like denial. It felt like standing inside the center of something we had both already changed by choosing it. When she kissed me again, there was more of us in it. More truth. The carefulness remained, but it was no longer distance. It was devotion to consequence. It was both of us knowing this could never be casual and letting the knowledge make us gentler rather than crueler. My hands found the line of her waist through the coat, then stilled there, asking without words. She stayed close. That was answer enough. I could feel the tension in her body, the effort it was taking not to lose the rest of herself entirely in the moment, and that effort was so achingly beautiful it almost broke me. I had wanted her. I had known that for days. What I had not understood was how much of that wanting was really the wish to be met. Not desired in passing. Not admired from a distance. Met. When the kiss ended, it did not end cleanly. It dissolved. A final, soft contact. My breath still caught against hers. Her hand still warm at my neck. The room returning in fragments. The radiator, the snow, the shape of the desk at my side. The city beyond the glass blurred into white and silver. I opened my eyes. Lena was looking at me as if I had become more dangerous to her, not less. That should have scared me. Instead, it made something in me go very quiet. No panic. No performance. Just the deep, unmistakable understanding that I would not be able to go back to the girl who thought proximity itself was the whole story. I had changed. Not because I'd been kissed by a powerful woman in a locked office at the top of an old Chicago building. Because I had chosen honesty with my eyes open. Lena let her hand slide slowly from my neck. The loss of contact was immediate and real. This can't become careless, she said. There it was. No fantasy after the kiss. No false softness. No pretending the world outside the office had dissolved. I nodded once, because I understood. I know, you deserve more than being hidden in pieces. The line struck me harder than the kiss had. For 1 second I couldn't speak, because there was affection in it. Respect. Fear of loss. And something deeper, something like grief for a version of this that could have happened in another life without all the damage already around us. I found my voice carefully. And you deserve something that doesn't cost you what you built. A long silence followed. Not empty. Full of all the things we were both intelligent enough to see and too honest now to deny. This was the completion the story needed. Not simple union, though that had happened. Not separation, though distance still stood waiting. Something more adult than either. Mutual recognition. Moral acceptance. The knowledge that wanting each other did not erase consequence, and consequence did not erase what had become true. Lena looked out briefly toward the snow-filled windows, then back at me. I don't know what this looks like tomorrow. Neither did I. That was the bittersweet part. Not uncertainty about feeling. We had crossed beyond that. The uncertainty belonged to the world, its rules, its witnesses, its appetite for turning human need into scandal. But for the first time, uncertainty did not feel like the same thing as denial. Tomorrow can be tomorrow, I said quietly. It wasn't a promise. It was the most honest thing I had. Something in her expression eased then, not into happiness exactly, but into a sorrowful kind of relief. The kind that comes when reality remains difficult and becomes bearable anyway. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, we stood close enough to remember what had just happened and far enough to survive it. Fragile. Real. Why? Unfinished. Lena reached for my hand then. Not like a lover, in a fantasy. Not dramatically. Just her fingers folding once through mine, brief and warm and devastatingly simple. One honest thing. Maybe this was the second. We stood there like that for only a few seconds, no more. Long enough for me to feel the shape of her hand and know I would carry the memory of it differently than every other touch in my life. Long enough for the room to settle around us into something quieter than fear. Then she let go first. Again, not as rejection. As care. You should leave before the roads get worse, she said. Practical. Gentle. A line that would have sounded ordinary to anyone else. I smiled then, small, unwilling, real. There she is. Lena's mouth changed. The ghost of warmth. Emily. Just my name. And somehow now, it no longer felt like a threat or a test. It felt like mine. I gathered the folder from the desk, though I no longer needed it, and the motion itself felt almost absurd after what had just happened. Paper. Process. Weather. Emails waiting downstairs. The company still there. The city still there. Nothing solved. Nothing erased. At the door, I turned back. I didn't know whether I was asking for reassurance or simply giving myself one more second to believe the room still held what it had held a moment ago. Lena was standing where I left her, one hand resting against the desk, snowlight at her back, watching me with that same impossible steadiness. No retreat in her face now. No denial. Just knowledge. I carried that with me when I walked out. The hallway was nearly empty. The assistant desk had been abandoned for the day. The lights glowed softer in the storm-darkened afternoon. Somewhere down the corridor, an elevator bell rang, and then fell silent again. I moved through it all feeling both more vulnerable and more whole than I had when I entered. Because completion is not always peace. Sometimes it is simply the end of lying to yourself. In the stairwell, halfway down, I stopped by the narrow window and looked out at the city almost erased by snow. Cars moving carefully. People bowed into the wind. Chicago still itself, still hard, still beautiful in its refusal to become gentler just because someone needed it to. I touched my mouth with my fingertips once, almost without thinking. Then I laughed softly at myself. Breath, not sound. At last. Not because everything was solved. Because the truth had become something I could finally feel without flinching from it. When I got back to my office, evening had already begun to gather. My desk lamp cast its familiar greenish light over the keyboard. My coffee sat untouched and cold, exactly where I'd left it. My inbox had filled again. Real life. Waiting patiently to reclaim me. I sat down slowly, opened one email, then another. And beneath the work, beneath the weather, beneath the still rising knowledge of what had happened upstairs, something in me remained steady. Not safe. Not innocent. Steady. Maybe that was the transformation after all. Not that I had become reckless. Not that I had become brave. That I had finally become honest enough to carry both desire and consequence in the same body without pretending one canceled the other. Outside my narrow window, the snow thickened, turning the city into softened light and blurred edges. Inside the old building, behind doors and policies and reputations, and all the careful structures human beings build to protect themselves from feeling too much. One truth now existed that had not existed before, and whatever tomorrow demanded of me, I would walk into it changed. Some endings do not close like doors, they fall softly like snow and leave the whole city altered. What kind of woman was I becoming now that I knew honesty could be both the wound and the warmth? Thank you for staying in this quiet, dangerous story with me. If it lingered with you, if you felt the weight of what was said, and everything that wasn't, stay a little longer. Leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for the next story that finds its way into the dark.